My name is Catherine D'Ignazio. I'm an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and have the great pleasure of hosting Genia for this artist talk today. And I also wanted to introduce Lucia Morelli, who's going to be helping to moderate the Q&A today. And the two of us are working together on a class called the Crowdsourced City. And that's partially why this lecture is happening, is because we have an opportunity here to work with Erin as a partner for that class. So in a sense, Erin is going to be in residence with our class. And then as part of that class, we are also working with the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture from the City of Boston and the Mayor's Office of Equity from the City of Boston. So we have a number of partners for that class, and we're thinking about monuments and public art and equity in our heritage and cultural landscapes. So to get started, I'm going to do a share screen and attempt to find my, there it is. This is the one I want to share. So I just want to acknowledge, I know we are all coming from very different places, you know, even my students for the class are distributed around the world across like 12 time zones, but speaking from the standpoint institutionally of MIT, we want to read the MIT Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. So MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. And then so there's a little bit more there about the groups that work together to develop this land acknowledgement statement. So I also wanted to acknowledge the really generous support of the MIT Center for Art, Science, and Technology, which is known as CAST. And in just a second, I'll paste a link to their website and their programs there so you can go look at their other events. They're doing a lot of really interesting, exciting work at the intersections of those things, art, science, and technology. And they're really who's made this lecture possible, and they're also who's made Erin's residency with our class possible. So we're really grateful for that. So without further ado, I want to introduce Erin Genia, Sisseton Wampatan Oyate. She, her pronouns. She is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and community organizer who specializes in Indigenous arts and culture. Her work in these areas is focused on amplifying the powerful presence of Indigenous peoples in the arts, sciences, and public realm to invoke an evolution of thought and practice that is aligned with the cycles of the natural world and the potential of humanity. Erin's a graduate of MIT, just to note. So she graduated from the ACT program, a master's in 2019. And she's also currently an artist in residence with the City of Boston. And that's how we became connected to her. And this spring, she's also in residence with our class, which is called the Crowdsourced City at MIT, where students are designing civic technology and media platforms to support her work to decolonize Boston's public art, monuments, and heritage landscape. And so just a note before we turn it over to her for the rest of the time. If you all have questions, please just put them in the chat, and Maria, Lucia, and I will be monitoring the chat, and then we will call or we'll ask them to Erin either on your behalf, or we may call on you to ask them following her presentation. So without further ado, Erin, I will just turn it over to you to lead the way. Thank you. Erin, did you hear me? Okay. Oh, right. Thank you. Our wonderful security measures made it so we can't.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. Good morning, everybody. It's such an honor to be here with you today. Thanks so much, Catherine, for inviting me to be part of Crowdsource City this semester. I also want to give a shout out of thanks to Karen Goodfellow and Sharon Amaguni, who have helped me to develop and steward this work. So I'm going to begin to share my screen with you now. Thanks for your patience. Genia Imakiapi. My name is Genia. I am a Dakota person. I'm a member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation in South Dakota. And as Catherine mentioned, my pronouns are she, her. I currently reside on the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people and within the territories of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag tribes in Medford, Massachusetts. I'm so excited to share the work that I've been doing over the past year as an artist in residence for the city of Boston. I have been working with the Department or Office of Emergency Management and the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture to develop this framework, which is a multi-level framework called Cultural Emergency Response. From my perspective as a Dakota person, as a community organizer and a cultural worker, I perceive that the United States is in a state of cultural emergency. And as a society, we don't recognize this. And as a result, we don't have a way to deal with it. I feel through all of the work that I've been doing that in order to truly address deep-seated issues that we face together, climate change, for example, economic inequality, institutional racism, these stark COVID-19 disparities, and ecological collapse, we have to shift our understanding to address these issues from a cultural lens. And this work is directly related to who I am, my experiences of being simultaneously inside and outside of American culture. I hail from peoples who've been targeted by the dominant culture for destruction. For our cultures have been through a cultural genocide, Dakota people and other indigenous people on this continent. And this legacy has given me the perspective to see the deep harms caused by American institutions and systems. And I know that I'm not alone in that. I believe that these harms should not be considered inevitable or acceptable, and instead that we should examine how our culture produces them so that we can end them. So in my residency, I have been considering how the techniques of emergency management can be creatively leveraged to do this work. But before I get into that, I just wanted to introduce myself and give you some backgrounds on my perspectives and my approaches to my work. My work centers Dakota philosophies and embodies Dakota cultural frameworks, including Wo Dakota, which is a set of guidelines that shows how to act in a reciprocal and respectful way in the world. I come from a family of artists, including my grandmother, my uncle, who is a painter. My kids are also artists, and many other family members. And I've been raised my whole life to continue my art practice. I work in many different forms, focusing on sculpture, on sound, performance, painting, ceramics, fiber arts, printmaking, and digital media. And my work really, in terms of content, explores the intersections between science and technology, civic arts practice, and Indigenous peoples' cultural fortification. I have a background, as I mentioned, in community organizing on issues of human rights, environmental and economic justice, and Indigenous peoples' rights. I also have a Master of Public Administration in Tribal Governance from the Evergreen State College, and I've worked professionally in the field of arts and culture for Indigenous people. And in 2019, I graduated from the ACT program here at MIT. In my work, it's always really important for me as a cultural value that I hold to bring others along with me. And there's so many amazing things that are happening in the field of Indigenous arts and culture and across many different fields. So I feel a cultural responsibility and interest in amplifying those efforts because I feel that that work that is being done is it's just so essential in the times that we're facing. And on the other side of that, for my own personal practice, I also have been engaged in a sort of test of contemporary arts from an Indigenous perspective, sort of realigning what the creative process and the arts and my arts practice means from a Dakota lens. And what goes along with that is the fact, this inescapable reality that I am a product of US assimilation policies that have attempted to strip my people of our culture and force the adoption of American ways. As an example, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was ratified the year that I was born. And so that makes me part of this first generation of Native American people who are able to freely practice and preserve our living cultural traditions within, since the establishment of this colonial government. So this really is a sacred responsibility, but it often places me at odds with dominant structures and attitudes. And much of my work involves questioning that Western cultural supremacy. So that's a little bit about me. And now I want to talk about what is a cultural emergency. When the pandemic first hit, I had just started my residency within the city of Boston, working with the Department or Office of Emergency Management. And I witnessed the office spring into action. And it was amazing to see how they were so primed and ready to deal with this public health emergency of such a great scale. And through the process of research and study, I began to understand that many of the emergencies that people face really stem from systemic cultural practices and beliefs, and how those beliefs continue to reverberate out into the world. For example, climate change is rooted in the dominant culture's philosophy that views the earth and its systems primarily as resources to extract and profit from. And you could go on. I mean, institutional racism, it comes from this very hierarchical thinking that certain individuals are better than others. And that is not based in reality. So as I was trying to understand the field of emergency management and also grapple with these great crises that we faced in 2020, I realized that we need the same kind of effort that the Office of Emergency Management leverages to address our problems at a cultural level. And so how do you define a cultural emergency? What I would say is that it's a state of instability and danger that really converges across a broad range of peoples, a broad range of places, events, and that all stem from cultural practices. I think we can all agree that cultural elements are at the heart of how society functions. The ideologies, the philosophies that drive our culture determine how our economic, our political, our social systems are established and how they continue to operate. Those doctrines that fuel societal progress can also create harm and lead to disasters on a massive scale. Cultural emergencies are urgent, and yet they often have long-term or ongoing contributing factors that are difficult to pinpoint and difficult to halt. I think, even just thinking of last year as a focal point for my residency and the events that we witnessed, and continuing on with each passing day, the evidence that we are in a state of cultural emergency is continuing to mount. People from across many walks of life are demanding change. And we're witnessing how unchecked cultural emergencies can intensify, how they can generate deeply intertwined disasters at every level of society. And this increases people's susceptibility to hazards, and it limits our collective resiliency. But even with this extreme level of crisis that we're facing, our society is resistant to altering this trajectory. But how long can we, or how long should we continue to go on like this? How long can we continue to accept the harms that our culture produces? So this is something that I've really been thinking a lot about, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity through this residency to not only think about this, but also think about how can we deal with it. With the mechanisms that we currently have to deal with cultural emergencies, they're really not as effective. They're not as effective as they need to be. We have mass protest movements. We have violent or nonviolent revolution, war, societal collapse. These are all things that can change our culture at a deep level. But without correcting course in a kind of a day-to-day way, or creating a process that our culture can follow, these cultural emergencies will just continue to accumulate, and they're going to create more crises that need emergency responses. So, I think a lot about how this is related to my my philosophy as a Dakota person, and how our culture is not like that, and how in each moment we are required to consider, based on Wo Dakota, how our actions will produce effects. And so I think, I'm really interested to have conversations about how we can build cultural transformations into our political, economic, and social systems. So what are these byproducts of American culture that are so harmful? The way that I've been thinking of those is that they're circumstances that result from regular economic, political, or social activities. They're things that are normalized, they're things that are accepted as collateral damage, and they have the potential to create both long-term and short-term emergency situations for people. And they range in scale from personal to societal to historical. And some of these examples, as I mentioned some of them already, but climate change, institutionalized racism and white supremacy, environmental catastrophes from resource extraction, mass extinctions, extreme political polarization, global war, militarism, and the possibility of nuclear annihilation, genocide, refugee crises, slavery, human trafficking, and incarceration, technology that's divorced from natural world-based wisdom, extreme wealth hoarding and poverty, pandemics, and other epidemics. This isn't a complete list, but I'm just saying this list to you because these are the things that come across my news every day, and I constantly am seeing all of these cultural crises that are happening. This piece right here is a piece that I created in 2016 that is a sculpture of an oil spill. And it shows how human beings are both responsible for this spill, but also endangered by it at the same time. So how did we get here? I think that we all need to come to terms with the fact that our American cultural norms emerged from the imperial philosophies of Western European colonialism and the Roman Empire. And our country is a settler colonial state that gained its economic wealth and political power from genocide, land theft, slavery, and war. Let's just be honest about that and really understand what that means. I don't think we should continue to cover that up or gloss over it. We have to come to terms with that. That legacy means that there's ongoing trauma to Indigenous people and to other people who are marginalized by the systems, these cultural foundations. And so, I've also been thinking about what are those ways? How do we identify those ways of thinking and acting within our culture that create emergencies and cause harm? And some of them that I've identified, and again, not a complete list, but just a few that immediately come to mind, are toxic individuality and thinking of ourselves as separate from the natural world and separate from others, a hierarchical and binary thinking and authoritarianism, misogyny and toxic masculinity, short-term thinking, idealizing greed and consumerism, violence as a tool, coercion through brute force and fear of dispossession, which is at the heart of the power structures of our country. Western cultural supremacy and forced assimilation into this way of thinking. And going along with that is a historical amnesia, which is harmful to us. Cultural appropriation, the wastefulness and squandering of energy, resources, and labor, and the undervaluing of youth, elders, and the extended family. So those are just some of the things that I have identified, and I think that there is a concerted effort that is needed to really think about what those things are and how they impact everything that we do, how they form the basis of our culture. Oh, sorry about that. So when you think about a cultural emergency, what exactly does that mean? Who is culpable for addressing cultural issues? And I think that we have to, look at the thought, beginning with the thought process, beginning with the individual. Culture permeates all sectors of life, and it starts with our personal decisions and our family activities and our community activities. And then from there, it expands outwards to our municipal activities, our regional, national, and systemic operations. So, we have to be accountable not only to the philosophies that guide our society's institutions and leaders, which is something that as a community organizer, I always, we're always focusing on the leadership and the institutions that perpetuate cultural harm or harm in general, and we should be, absolutely. But I think the thing that is shifting with the cultural responsibility is that we also have to think of our own role in that and our own place in that. What is the thinking that we're doing, and where does that come from? I also believe that the cultural supremacy that's at the heart of these norms has really held our culture back. And it prevents us from engaging in a process of critique that can only strengthen our society. We have this false idea of American exceptionalism, and it's really not based in reality. So I think, this is very complicated. There's so many aspects to this. And I, as I think about how my role in this, we all, in order to survive, we all have to orient ourselves in some way to these societal systems that create harmful byproducts, and sometimes we know the harms they cause. I know when I'm going to the gas station and I fill up my tank to get somewhere, I know that oil, that gas is coming from the ground through processes that harm the earth. And I know that when I drive the car, that it's creating pollution. and at the same time, I am willing to accept those in the course of living life. And so I think it is possible to acknowledge the challenges of this dynamic, but also provide space to be critical about how we orient ourselves to these systems. So I guess the bottom line is that everybody in our society shares some responsibility for perpetuating cultural harm. And so each person must honestly own their own position and role within this state of cultural emergency. As we hold our institutions accountable, we must also hold our communities accountable and ourselves. And I don't think that this is going to happen overnight. I think that changing our behaviors is probably one of the most difficult things we can do, but it requires strong support. It requires economic stability, community support and involvement, and time. So a little bit about this piece before I move on to the next slide is that this is called Fourth World Flag, and it shows the powerful Dakota iconography of the morning star, which signifies a way of life that is deeply connected to the natural world and teaches respect for relationships between living systems. I have put many colors in this star to celebrate the diversity of Indigenous people around the globe and people around the globe, and to signify how, even though we all are different, that we must come together. And when we do, it will be a beautiful thing. So where does emergency management come into this? And this is the interesting part. For me anyway, through this work, I've found this to be very interesting. That, I think that in order to address these problems, which are among the most pressing issues of our time, we have to rework and rethink the systems that contribute to them. And emergency management techniques are a powerful tool that can assist us in this work. What's great about emergency management is that these procedures and protocols work behind the scenes. They marshal funding, they marshal resources and people power to rapidly fix dire issues. They plan for every contingency, and they strategize and budget for the phases before, during, and after an emergency to ensure public safety. This is the kind of effort that we need to address the root cultural causes of major societal emergencies, like climate change, institutional racism, economic inequality, health disparities, ecological devastation, and Indigenous peoples' dispossession. If we were to consider economic inequality and emergency and utilize the resources of emergency management to address it, I think we could do it. I also wanted to share this image here of that I kind of reworked the seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with my face in there to show how the systems of the state, are really not, they're not operating for the benefit of Native people. And I also wanted to show how, talk about a little bit that it is through the efforts of ongoing organizing that things like this seal can be changed. So after years of advocacy, the state will now be reconsidering new designs for this horribly racist seal. So, I think one thing to understand is that these cultural emergencies that we're facing are not new. They're historic, they're ongoing, and yet they continue to threaten our future. And in order to begin this work, a cultural emergency response requires that we realize our mistakes and learn from them, and then we change course to move forward. We actually have a lot of tools already available at our disposal to do this. Many movements, leaders, scholars, artists, community workers, agencies, and organizations have already done the work of determining the root causes of our cultural emergency and proposing and enacting solutions. A cultural emergency response within this framework can bring these ideas together and these practices together to contribute to a more widespread and grassroots cultural change that's required of this moment. Now, I really feel that this model could help streamline processes to bring everybody together and to create sort of a roadmap to address cultural emergencies. And this piece that you see on the slide here is a performative character of mine called Earthling. And Earthling is a reminder that underneath people's closely held ideas, underneath the systems that capitalize upon us and colonize us, are adopted ideologies. We are earth-based beings. We're not just of the earth, we are the earth. Human understanding has come far away from the reality that we are not separate from the earth. How would our responsibilities to ourselves, each other, and our world change if this reality was the basis of our collective thought and action? So what tools need to be developed? This is like sort of the nuts and bolts, which I'm really excited to get into with the crowdsourced city students. But some of the things that I've come up with so far are that we need to collectively identify how those harmful ways of thinking and acting that that create emergencies and disasters. We have to identify how they form the basis of our laws, our policies, our procedures, and determine how we can create responsive systems or change existing systems so that we no longer uphold those things. And that we develop ways to elevate the perspectives and power of those who are marginalized by these systems. And also at the top of my list is recognizing the rights of the natural world. This piece here, Dakota Pride Banner, is a piece I created for the city of Seattle in 2017. And I created this piece to bring more Dakota imagery into public space. This piece was a catalyst for me because it helped me to understand how public space is an extension of settler colonization, and where the erasure of Indigenous people and histories and the supplanting of Western doctrines over Indigenous cultures is enacted. And I feel that this work really needs to be done in a very public way. And a lot of things can happen in public space to start these conversations. And I'll talk more about what I've been doing in terms of my projects. So I guess, I think that a state of cultural emergency impacts, because it's cultural, it impacts us at every level of society in every field. Science and technology, economics and business, policy and administration. But because this is a cultural emergency, I think that there's a huge level of possibility that exists and responsibility within the cultural sector. So the arts, humanities, religion, et cetera. And for my part, as an artist and cultural worker, I've been considering how I can reframe the language and tools of crisis response to address this, state of cultural emergency using creative intervention. So right now, and through the end of my residency, I'm working on cultural emergency response plans based upon FEMA manuals that are in the form of lino-cut zines. I'm working on creating performative and training exercises based on this cultural emergency response framework, mapping using GIS data to identify cultural emergencies in space, on the land, and also creating sculptural forms that there's a whole culture of emergency response. There's materials, there's outfits, there's emergency kits, there's things that are used, tools, and things that are material objects that are used by emergency management. And so I've been rethinking those too. For example, we'll be working on what would be in a cultural emergency kit and creating some sculptural forms. And then I'm also creating an emergency vest that is a beaded vest, Dakota style. So those are some of the things that are forthcoming and you'll see. And then some of the things that I've been doing in terms of my community work with the city of Boston, with people, I'll share those too. So the Indigenous Peoples Medicine Fire was a medicine fire that happened in November at Asanet Wampanoag tribal lands to focus on spiritual healing during the time of COVID-19. And this came about through my collaboration with Robert Peters, who's a Mashpee Wampanoag artist, and who I worked with on a project called Centering Justice, Indigenous Artist Perspectives on Public Space. And through this work, we have been talking about and advocating for public lands that could be set aside in the city of Boston for Native American cultural use and stewardship. And later on this spring, we're also going to be supporting the Massachusetts tribe to hold a medicine fire in Franklin Park. So stay tuned for that. And then I also organized a series of panels, virtual panels that was called Confronting Colonial Myths in Boston's Public Space. And this was in response to the mayor of Boston declaring a public health emergency in 2020 because of the disproportionate effects of the coronavirus pandemic, specifically on communities of color. And so I wanted to bring Indigenous people's voices and experiences to the forefront of these conversations around institutional racism, specifically because with the Black Lives Matter protests happening and monuments coming under question and memorials coming under question at that time, I felt that Indigenous peoples really should have a seat at the conversation for that. And so I created this because in Boston, we have a lot of monuments and memorials that really present this mythology of colonization as a good thing. And that's not the case for Native people. Hasn't been a good thing for us. It continues to be, the colonial project continues to be devastating for our people. And we can see that in multiple ways, but most pressingly with COVID-19. So the panel was a series, and there were 3 different panels, and they brought together Indigenous artists, leaders, and allies from across the city to talk about these issues. And so I guess the other thing that I wanted to say about this is that the city of Boston is also, it's on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and it's in the territory of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag people. And I feel like this is a reality that goes unacknowledged. And largely, people in the city really don't know that, residents. And this history has been whitewashed. And Boston has been an epicenter of colonization of the entire continent since the first settlers arrived here from Plymouth, England, over 400 years ago. And so to see these colonial monuments in the city, it really adds insult to injury because they uphold this slavery, this land dispossession, this ethnic cleansing and genocide that settler descendants continue to benefit from. And so I would like to share with you a clip which is I'm gonna stop sharing this and start sharing my other screen, or other window, I should say. Thanks for your patience here. So this is a clip of the panels.
Living in these colonial cities, in my experience, I am choking, suffering, like on visual representation that demands that I don't exist.
How do you see monuments and memorials in the public sphere contributing to the public health emergency of racism and affecting the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people in your communities? What work are you doing to combat this or to draw attention to this?
Things are so covered up here, and it has an impact in how, it has an impact when we go out and we're trying to talk to non-Native people about things and trying to link our struggles together. And the reason is because so many people in this state actually think that we're extinct.
All the way down the walkway was nothing but monuments honoring these colonizers, and you know, they're towering over you, seeing the letters being kind of carved into the stone. It's like, by having to endure that and then also to be erased simultaneously.
When we're looking at public spaces, what is the reverence that is evoked from that? When we are walking the pathways of our ancestors, where are those spots that evoke, my goodness, you know, I need to leave an offering here?
And for us, what it is very important, it is to uncover what it is the history and the networks that actually make possible those monuments and those names to happen, that actually make possible to perpetuate the normalization of white supremacy.
Perhaps space needs to be made in our society to think of Indigenous art as well as having that same sort of weight and importance, both ideologically and materially.
When we're talking about monuments, change, representation, where are the Indigenous people? Many of us are tending to historical trauma. Many of us are just trying to survive.
The monument about Christopher Columbus is not about the past. When we put up a monument, it's about the present. So to be really clear when we're thinking about what monuments we're putting up is, what are we saying about ourselves? What are we presenting about ourselves? What do we want the world to see about ourselves?
And I want to share with you now some of the next steps that are coming. So as a follow-up to Confronting Colonial Myths, I'm working with the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture to organize a special meeting for Indigenous residents of the city to offer testimony to the Boston Art Commission on monuments and public art, and to help to contribute to a strategy for those moving forward. All of the framework that I've been working on creating, as well as the art pieces that I'm doing, are all going to be housed on a boston.gov webpage, so that people can refer to that, and that the work can continue to live on, you know, in the digital realm. So that will be forthcoming. So please stay tuned for the website, which will be coming out. And again, just really wanted to thank you for your time today, and open to hearing any questions that you may have. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Erin, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us. Fantastic talk. And I just want to take moderator's privilege to ask one quick question, hopefully, and then we'll let other folks form questions in the chat. I see that they're starting to come in. So what, you mentioned this very intriguing question, what goes in a cultural emergency management response kit? And I'm just wondering what does go there? So have you started to answer that question yet? And like what goes in that kind of kit?
you. So I've been homeschooling my daughters during this pandemic, and I asked them the other day what they thought would go into a cultural emergency kit. I think it's different for everybody. One of the things that I've been working with them is this little blue pamphlet that is a guide to critical thinking. And my daughter was like, you should put that in there. And so I think that the items that could be in a cultural emergency kit really change depending on what the cultural emergency is, just like in emergency management, you'll have something different for a flood versus something for a snowstorm, kind of thing.
That's great. Maria Lucia, do you want to take over the moderation from you?
Sure. Thank you, Erin, for sharing your work with us. This has been really amazing. Here are some questions in the chat, so please just write it or raise your hand and I'll call you out. So we can start with Edward Rios. I'm gonna ask you to unmute if you want to ask Erin your question.
Oh yes, I apologize. Do you see my question in the chat?
Sure.
Could you repeat it, please?
Sure. I would like to know who is indigenous, who is native, has Turtle Island been cut off at the border, and what is the Lakota perspective of immigration regarding Mexicans and Latin Americans? Thank you for your work.
Thank you for the question. I think that this question of who is indigenous is a very long question that we could probably spend a long time, this entire time, talking about. Indigenous, the term indigenous, really what it denotes is peoples who are living on the land that they have continued to live on for many thousands of years, and who are living in a relationship of reciprocity with that land. That the term indigenous also indicates a relationship to dominant colonizing powers. And I would say that there are so many different tribes, like within the borders of the United States alone, there's over 570 federally recognized tribes, each having their own, distinct forms of government and cultures and languages and relationships to each other, relationships to the colonizing powers. It's a very complicated topic, and yet there are also very distinct definitions that are of Native American, of certain terms, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians, that have legal meanings within the government to government relationships, and in terms of the self-determining nature of tribes within these borders. So to answer your question, to the rest of your question about Mexican and Latin American immigration, are they indigenous? I think that this is where we have to look at our history, and we have to really understand the history of colonization in Latin America, in the ways that colonization has impacted tribal communities there. I think that that topic is a really huge area of consideration, and the decolonial work that needs to happen begins with understanding that history.
Thank you, Erin. We have another question from Caroline Jones. Caroline, I don't know if you want to answer in your question again.
Oh, sure. Hi, Erin. It's great to see you and really nice to catch up with your work. My question is about kinship which is not a word that you used. And it's becoming such an interesting part of environmental and ecological knowledge systems. In other words, Indigenous communities are working with this idea, even with the National Park Service, which you rightly identified as a colonial structure. They're working with these authorities to forward something called traditional environmental knowledge. And I find it incredibly generative for the work we have to do going forward. The idea of the more than human and the mineralogical that we need to consider in this more expansive conception of kinship. Partly because if you look at the structure of social activism in terms of, say, gay marriage rights, it largely succeeded because of the idea of relation, that these were our children or our aunts and uncles, and that we could extend to them this idea of love and union because we were kin, right? So I guess I'm just excited by the possibility of your thinking in a forward-moving way. Can we benefit collaboratively with, long-held Indigenous epistemologies of kin to move forward in these emergencies of our relationship to Earth? So that's really, it's like a packed question, but I'm hoping you can help us with it. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Caroline. It's nice to see you. I think that's a really great question, and I think that that is what needs to happen. That my work stems from Dakota philosophies, and relationality is at the basis of those philosophies. I think that, there's multiple things that I'm thinking to answer your question. One of those is that traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, has really been hailed as a way forward. But what I would, and I think that it is a way forward, but I also think that along with that work, we have to do the really hard work of understanding that the appropriation of those techniques and those ways of being in the world is also quite harmful to Indigenous people who have originated that knowledge. I think this concept of kinship is, that term is a way to describe, I guess I get a little bit frustrated with whatever, terms or buzzwords that are coming up in a way that is seen as trendy in terms of our Western thought. Like, one of the approaches of Western thought is that there are trends in the thought, and that today it's kinship and it's more than human. But for Native people, for Dakota people, this relationality has formed the basis of our cultures for thousands of years. It is not a new thing. It is an essential thing. And so I think that any work that we do to move our cultures forward together, we have to really look at the ways that we're approaching traditional ecological knowledge and make sure that we have our ethical frameworks in place for accessing those ways of knowledge. I often work with the concept of mitakuye oyasi, which means we're all related. And it's a really deep philosophy that basically means that we're not just related to other people, to our families, but we're also related to the animals, we're related to the plants, we're related to the stones, to the air, to the electricity, to this plastic that is encasing my computer that I'm looking at you, through. And that is such a fundamental part of our way of life and looking at the world. And yet it is so, it's like science and technology today is just now coming around to realizing this. And so I guess I do get a little bit frustrated with the approach that that these ways can save us. I don't think that they can save us unless we look at how we got to this place of separation.
Thank you, Erin. We have one last question from Lily. Lily, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Hi, yes. I'm so sorry, I'm on my phone. But Erin, I just wanted to thank you so much for your talk. It was so wonderful and inspiring. And I guess I wanted to ask, for me, I'm also think of myself as like a cultural worker. And I think the format of the cultural emergency toolkit is very, very useful. I do work with communities in Chinatown here in Boston, and I was thinking about the idea of an emergency, and the residents that I work with are facing all sorts of emergencies during this time, with housing and with the pandemic. And I wonder if you could talk about how you would frame the cultural emergency when it sort of at the risk of sounding like scarcity is an issue, but when there are the reality of limited resources, and when folks are at least the folks that I work with, I think sometimes have anxieties about how are my other emergencies going to get filled in addition to the cultural emergency that we're in. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Thank you, Lily. I think that's where this concept of cultural emergency in this conceptual framework, how does it hit the ground? How does it begin to impact our lives, our day-to-day lives? And I think that in order to begin that process, we have to each own where we are within this sort of cultural spectrum, I guess, and see what can we do to begin to have these conversations. I actually do really think that we need some kind of a national or large scale declaration where we can say, this is a cultural emergency, and what are we going to do collectively, about it? I think we need to recognize the ways that our culture has created these situations of economic instability for people. And by taking that first step of understanding this as a cultural emergency, understanding those economic issues as a cultural emergency, we can then begin to collectively figure out what to do about it. And I don't know what that is, but I want to be in conversation with people about it. And I want to hear from other people about how we can move forward.
Erin, thanks so much. And we've gone over time. So I just want to say thank you. There's things coming up in the chat. I wish we could give you really large, loud applause, but that's not technically possible on the Zoom, but hopefully everyone's sort of doing that quietly in their house right now.